What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. I have found an inexpensive alcohol-based marker with, dramatic pause, a brush nib. Yes, I swear it is the hardest thing to find an inexpensive marker that has a brush nib. Almost exclusively all inexpensive markers have a bullet nib, which is tiny and inflexible but still bleeds a lot. So it doesn't really serve the same purpose as a brush nib, and plus you just have a lot less variation in your lines and a lot less control overall. So I did it. I found an inexpensive marker that has a brush nib, and that is the Blick Studio brush markers. I purchased these with my own money, and I got the set of 24 and I purchased them for $39.69. Obviously that doesn't include tax, and I believe I got a free shipping promotion. So yeah, my whole order was about 40 bucks, and these really piqued my interest. I had heard about them. I had been thinking about them for a while, asking you guys if you were interested in a review. A lot of you said yes. I've just personally really been interested in trying them out for myself. The case is obviously very reminiscent of a Copic marker case, although the Copic markers, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they come in sets of 24. I think Copics either come in a set of 12 or a set of 36, but the Blick markers come in a set of 12, 24, 48, or I believe you can go ham and get the whole 96. I think 96 is the color range, I believe so. I'm trying to look online, so that's what I'm basing my information off of. You can also get them in sets as small as 6, which is really nice as well. And you'll notice like there's very little wiggle room in this case. They're actually pretty like jammed in there. It can be kind of hard to pull them out and fit them back in, but if you were traveling, like, you wouldn't have to worry about your markers bumping and grinding against each other. Like, it's a very, very sturdy case. It's a hard plastic, which is nice. It's durable. And I took all my markers out and rearranged them according to the layout on the box. I just thought that was easier, and that's also how I swatched them. And also just note about this review, I will not be demoing the markers in this review. I'm going to save the demo for this Friday's video and sort of color and illustration as this week's Artsy Fartsy Friday. So if you want to stay tuned for the demo, you're gonna have to subscribe. I know a bunch of you are like, oh, that's annoying, but also, you guys know my reviews are like 30 minutes long usually, and I'm gonna try and make this one shorter, more to the point, and just tell you guys whether or not I think these markers are good and how they compare to Copic markers, especially because of the brush nib. I feel like these will be a lot more comparable to Copic markers, and I wanna see how they stand up and how they perform. If you guys have seen my cheap marker review videos before, I reviewed the concept markers and the oh hoo hoo markers, for all of you who corrected me on my pronunciation. That review is still performing really, really well, getting upwards of like 100 views a day. So clearly you guys like these videos. I am currently tracking down more cheap markers to review on this channel and give you the information as the consumers whether or not you should purchase them for yourself. But if you guys have seen those reviews, you kind of know the breakdown of what I'm gonna cover. I'm gonna cover blendability, layering, do they hold up to rubbing alcohol or the Copic colorless blender, and how do they stand up to various multi-liners and inking techniques. So that is basically the grounds that I'm going to cover, and without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so I kind of already have my chart pre-mapped out for all of the categories that we are going to cover, but I wanted to give you guys a little bit more insight to the size of the markers. I will show you a side-by-side comparison. Obviously, this is my Copic marker BG45 marker, and next to it is my black Blick Studio marker. The Copic markers are a little bit longer in length. They feel like the same width, although the barrel on the Blick markers is a little bit different, having more of like a hexagonal shape to it. It's not really rounded, and it has these edges that obviously prevent it from rolling, where the Copic markers are more smooth. Now let's just compare the chisel nibs really quick. We can see pretty clearly they're similar in size and shape. I really don't have complaints about chisel nibs on cheaper marker alternatives. I find that they perform really well, and in many cases they outperform the Copic marker chisel nib. For the most part, from what I can tell, these look to be pretty much the same kind of deal. But what we really want to know is the brush nibs. And I will obviously do more of a comparison once we break it down, but let's just have a quick look here. One thing I noticed right off the bat is that the Blick brush nib seems a little bit smaller, a little bit shorter, and it comes to less of a taper at the top. So the Copic marker is a lot more elongated, and the tip really tapers off at the very, very end, giving you kind of a very fine brush tip right at the very, very top, which you can get into a lot of fine details with. Right off the bat, the Blick Studio marker does not appear to have that same taper, although it does still come to a pretty nice point, and it's going to be hard to know about the differences in flexibility without actually testing them out, which we will do. But really quickly, let's talk about the swatches and sort of compare what colors you get in this set and who this set might be good for. And really quickly, one thing that I do want to note is that Dick Blick carries 2 different types of studio markers. Also, please pardon my nails. Oh my god. Blick carries 2 types of studio markers. They have their regular studio markers, and then they have these studio brush markers. The regular studio markers are going to have that bullet nib. But in this set, you get a black, which is great. Always very nice to have and very standard in most basic color sets. You get a cool gray, which I appreciate, even though I would like to see more grays in a basic set like this. Having one is actually kind of a surprise. We have 4 greens here, and I think they cover a nice spectrum. We have one that's kind of a seafoam green, obviously kind of a darker, more evergreen sort of color. We have our kind of dark yellowy green, more of like your olive color, and then you have your very kind of bright, vivid green, which I think is really great. You get a good range of blues as well, which I always appreciate, and they cover a lot of different grounds. So you have your kind of dark indigo, you have your nice kind of light baby blue, you have a very nice bright blue, kind of a brighter blue but with more of a true blue tone, so this would be really nice, and it would kind of pair well with this more darker blue, whereas this one would pair well with probably more of a lighter blue. And then you get this periwinkle color. Now what's cool about these blues is I can see them all working really, really well together, but they also work really well as standalone shades. And then you get this violet in here, which is nice. It's a little bit too vivid for my personal taste. I would have liked something that was a little bit more on the blue side or a little bit more on the red side, because if this is just a standalone bright true purple, it's kind of hard to compare it with anything else in the set. So it was a bold move including this, in my opinion, just because you can't really use it with other colors. I mean, you can. I guess we'll see in the layering test, but just looking at the set at a glance, I look at this color and think, okay, great, but what do I use that with, you know? Whereas like the blues, like I said, they work really well by themselves, but they also have different undertones that pair nicely with other colors. You get a nice red in here, which I appreciate. You guys might remember in the Ohuhu marker review, I talked about the red being not red enough and then the other red being too dark. This is what I would have liked to have seen. You know, you have this nice kind of neutral red, not too warm, not too cool, and then you have a slightly darker version. So these would do really well on their own and also work really, really well together. Then you have this very berry shade, which is pretty. I like that. That could potentially pair well with the violet, although if this violet was just a little bit more red toned, that would be even more of a perfect pairing. You get a nice pink in here, which again is just kind of vivid for my personal taste. If this had been a little bit more red or a little bit more orange, I feel like it would have been more versatile, although I do get why they include these very true forms of these colors, like the red, like the pink, like the violet. But if you're gonna throw one color in there, it's nice to have a buddy for that color that you can use it with. You get dark umber and dark brown, and as well as like 2 more earth tones down here that I'll talk about. These are really, really nice. I like that dark umber has that more red tone and dark brown has that more kind of olivey tone. Sienna is obviously kind of more of an orangey brown, whereas caramel is more of like a yellowy golden brown. Doesn't obviously have a lot of brown in there, but I do like that they included it, because you can see saffron here would have just been a little bit too saturated to have in place of caramel, so I like that they included both because you could pair these together. So I like that there are definitely 4 solid earth tones in there, and I appreciate that because you don't always find that in a basic set. And I like the range. You know, you do have kind of 2 darker ones and then one mid-tone and one that's a little bit lighter. This peach color is really nice. I actually think this is really pretty, and I can't really think of a very clear Copic marker alternative to this color. So in my mind, this color sticks out as pretty unique. Orange is nice. It could pair nicely with red. It could pair nicely with peach. It could also work well with like this saffron color, which I think is really pretty. So even though this is kind of a very true pigment, they gave us other colors in this set that pair well with it. And then we have saffron and canary yellow, which I think are really nice. I like the true yellow, and I like that they gave us something to kind of tone it down with. So I like the color variety. Obviously, the biggest thing missing from this set would sort of be any of your skin tones. That being said, you could definitely do some medium to darker skin tones with this set, which is likely what I will end up doing for the demo portion later on this week. But I feel like most of the earth tones in this set are the wrong undertone to be used as a skin tone in a full color illustration. Maybe sienna could be shaded with dark umber, but you don't really have like your highlight or blending color, which I like to use with skin tones. So that, in my opinion, is the biggest setback of this set. However, you're only getting 24 colors, so I see why they include, you know, strictly colors, and the earth tones are more to ground those colors and not really to create a full illustration. So obviously this set would work really well for concept artists, work really well if you're just doing kind of like product design, or you're just looking to sort of get a basic set and then build from there. I know somebody mentioned in the concept marker video that they only buy concept markers individually, so that way they can only get those earth tones and neutrals that they're striving for, which I think is a really great approach actually. And if none of these colors really appeal to you, you know, you look at this and you go, I don't use any of these colors in my work, or I would really only use, you know, 3 or 4 of them, don't get the sets. You can buy individually on dickblick.com. They're still very reasonably priced. And, you know, I feel like that's a great way to go about it too. And in fact, I was tempted to buy some individually as well, but I thought this would be a good challenge for me to try and create a full cohesive illustration with just these colors and kind of see what happens. And knowing that it didn't have any of the sort of usual skin tones that I use was going to be an additional challenge for me. So we'll see how that turns out. As of right now, I have not sketched out that illustration yet, so we'll see. But like I said, stay tuned for Friday's video because that's where you're gonna see that. But now let's kind of get to the nitty-gritty of like how these markers perform. One thing that I do like to do is test the layerability of these colors. Can you get different variations of a color by layering it on several times? So let's test that out with something like this leaf green. I feel like that's enough of a mid-tone that you're gonna be able to see a difference, and it's not gonna be like too light or too bright. So what I'm basically going to do is just kind of put down a basic swatch. So basically this is layer 1, and then as this layer kind of sets and dries, I will go over a portion of it a second time, and then a third time, and then a fourth time, and so on, and I will number those accordingly. Okay, so I think I've gotten this to the point where it's not really getting darker, and I have kind of an observation about it. I do feel like after about 3 to 4 layers, it doesn't really get darker. Although once I got to about 5 and especially 6 layers, the color does appear to be a lot smoother. So the first layer kind of had a little bit of like grit and graininess to it. Same thing with the second and third layers. And then once it was like 4 and up, the texture of the paper, it seemed to like be a lot smoother. So that is one thing to note. And just another thing I wanted to mention is that I'm currently working on some cardstock. And obviously you can see the difference in the bleed through. This is not particularly heavy cardstock, so if you're going to be doing some heavy blending like this, be mindful of your paper because it could completely bleed through to the other side. So just something to be wary of, but I do think that if you can get at least 3 layers of color intensity, that's pretty good. I think Copic markers can go a little bit more. I think even the Ohuhu markers went a little bit more, but I'm not mad at 3 layers because you can get some pretty good versatility with that. So now I want to test the different layering between different types of colors. So I want to kind of test not necessarily blendability, but can you layer color from a different color family on top of, you know, another one and kind of see how that works. So I'm gonna take this periwinkle color to see if layering on top of the orange will add sort of any effect, if it'll manipulate the color or layer in any sort of weird way. With Copic markers, if you layer a color that's too light over a darker color, it will sort of lift the darker color, so that's kind of what I'm testing for here. It seems very similar to Copic markers in that way. You can see it definitely desaturates that orange, which is sometimes what you want. So I actually think that that can be really helpful because I don't necessarily have to have a darker orange to shade with. I can just shade with a complementary color like that periwinkle and get sort of that same effect. And obviously I'm not testing blending yet because that will be down here. But let's find a color to kind of shade this purple with. Let's try a couple of different ones. Let's try this red. The red and the purple are more competing with each other rather than these where like they kind of like layered pretty easily. These are a little bit less smooth. Layering the purple over top kind of seals that red. So that looks a little bit better in my opinion. And maybe you guys aren't seeing a lot of that. Let me try something with the pink too. So if I layer a really light color, oh, okay, so it does lift, and this is very similar to the Copic markers as well. So the ink intensity as it hits the paper reminds me a lot of Copic markers. And when I did the Ohuhu marker review, the ink in those markers was very potent. It sort of penetrated the paper really quickly and put down a really smooth, flat layer of color. Copic markers, you kind of have to build them a little bit slower, and they don't penetrate the paper quite as quickly. They penetrate the paper differently depending on whether it's a dark color or a light color. So with Copic markers, if you layer a light color on top of a dark color, it lifts. That wasn't something I noticed particularly with the Ohuhu markers, and I think that that's just due to like a different ink formula. This ink reminds me a little bit more of the Copic markers in that it is a little bit grainy when you first lay it down, and you really have to build it up to fill in those gaps. That also depends on your paper type though. But I do think that I like that these kind of layer and lift the same way that the Copic markers do. Let's get into blending a little bit, and let's start off easy by kind of doing a very obvious gradient in this set. Let's try blending canary yellow into saffron. I'm gonna try blending first with the chisel tip. It's definitely blending. It's not blending super well. Let me try with the brush nibs and see what that does. So with the brush nib, you can get a much more tapered effect. A good brush nib will sort of blend itself. So that's blending a lot more seamlessly in my opinion, and I actually like that a lot. Let's try blending one color family into another color family just to see how that works. With a brush nib, I have pretty high expectations and therefore pretty high hopes that you can blend different colors. That's actually not looking too bad in my opinion. I think that that looks pretty good. We blended from two pretty different colors and it looks pretty seamless the whole way. So I'm actually very impressed with the blendability. It seems like not only can you blend within color groups, but you can also blend between color groups, which is really, really important. Let's talk about this brush nib, you guys. Let's just talk about it. That's obviously something that you guys would be interested in if you are considering these markers. So let's compare the Blick brush nib to the Copic brush nib. And basically I'm just going to put down some strokes with the Blick brush nib. Working with it thus far, just in these few swatches, it doesn't feel very different from the Copic marker one. This is obviously a different color than the one I used. So the Copic one is definitely more flexible. In that first stroke, I feel like I had a little more control and it tapered down to be a little bit finer. Could just be also that I have more comfort with this brush nib, which is likely the case. And I actually feel like those fine lines with the Copic marker were a little bit thicker. I can definitely get them thinner, but because it's so flexible, my inherent nature is to push down more. And the Blick brush nib is actually, it's a little stiffer, which isn't actually a bad thing. And I don't really know that I have a preference between the two other than just being more comfortable with the Copic marker one, but I feel like they yield pretty similar results, and with more practice and more time, obviously, I think they would come to mimic each other almost exactly. Let's look at the chisel nib, although I'm pretty sure that I know what's going to be the case here. It's a basic chisel nib. I think for both of these markers, my biggest complaint with the Copic chisel nib is actually that I feel like it dries out and it kind of has like this different texture. It's not a bad thing, it's just different. I actually feel like I think the cheaper markers hold the ink in the chisel nib a little bit better for some reason, and I can get like a more even layer. That's the comparison between the two nibs. I actually feel like they're more similar than they are different. The only notable difference for me is that the brush nib on the Blick marker, the Blick Studio brush marker, is just slightly less flexible, but I still feel like I got the same amount of control with it, and the lines that I can get with it are just as fine for the most part as they are with the Copic marker. No complaints there. Next, I want to compare ink durability. So as you can see here, I have written out some of my most used inking tools, including the Prismacolor Kohl Erase pencils, because I do use those a lot as well, particularly with to sketch, so it's definitely a concern if those smudge using these markers. Let's obviously, I think yellow is the best thing that would show smudging, and hopefully I don't ruin the nib. But let's see. So I'm gonna give these a fair second to sort of dry down before going over top of them instantly with ink, but I feel like a minute, you know, 60 seconds is totally a fair test. So let's test the Sakura Pigma Microns. These are some of my tried and true inking tools. No visible smudging, actually. Really nice, that held up really well. Let's test the Sharpie pen. This tends not to really bleed, although very minimal smudging, and I can kind of tell just because the nib on the marker is getting a little stained. So let's kind of clean that off. All right, the Kohl Erase pencil. Yeah, that picked up a lot of lead on there and kind of smudged too. But that's not very surprising. The Pentel pocket brush, I'm pretty sure is gonna smudge, so I'm actually gonna do that one last. Let's try the Tombow brush. That's holding up pretty beautifully. Okay, the Triplus, holding up pretty well, but the more you layer it, the more it's gonna smudge, and that's just because it's a water-based ink, and so the more like the paper kind of gets wet, the more it's gonna smudge. And I'm sure the Stabilos are gonna be the same way. Actually, the Stabilo is holding up really well too. Actually better than the Triplus. The Triplus, the ink is bleeding, it's kind of feathering out a little bit, but it's not necessarily smudging, but your lines will get a little bit more fuzzy. Okay, Pentel pocket brush, show me what you got. Oh yeah, that's smudged. Yep, and you can tell because the nib on the marker is definitely tainted, but that's a pretty easy fix. You can just kind of rub it off on a piece of paper. It'll go away eventually. I'm not gonna worry about it too much right now. But so that kind of gives you a good idea of what kind of inking tools work best with this. The Sakura Microns held up great, and if you have those in your collection, these will work fine. Sharpie pen did okay. Obviously, Kohl Erase is gonna smudge, as will most forms of graphite. And the Stabilo fine liners did really well too, as did the Tombow brush, although usually with any brush pen, I like to color first and ink after. But any of the ones that I mentioned would probably be fine. Rubbing alcohol test. This is something that I started doing recently because I do use this occasionally in my work, and so it's important for me to know whether or not I can use the colorless blender or rubbing alcohol to get certain effects. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put down a pretty dark color. This is a beautiful blue, by the way. This is 074 ink blue, really pretty. And I'm gonna put down another swatch, and I'm gonna do it with red, because last time when I did this with the Ohuhu markers, the red had a really interesting result. Now I'm gonna take my colorless blender marker and see if this lifts the color or if it manipulates it in any way. But you can see it sort of just manipulates the color away from the area where you put the blender. And this is a really cool way to create texture, create patterns. You can fix minor mistakes with this, although that's not really what I would recommend trying to use it for, but you can use it for a lot of really cool things. And this, with the colorless blender, it behaves very similarly to the way my Copic markers behave. So the Blick ink and Copic ink behaves very similarly in my opinion, and I feel very familiar using it. So yeah, the colorless blender, definitely works. The rubbing alcohol is always kind of a bit hit or miss anyway, so this should be fun. I'm actually gonna kind of try and use this as like a guard against my other work, and I'm just gonna spray this a couple times. So it is kind of like splatters the ink. That's interesting. I've never noticed that before. And it is kind of lifting, but it's not a real consistent like lift. But it will, basically what it'll do is kind of like disperse the color and lighten the color. And I don't necessarily think this is behaving any differently than it would with Copic markers, but with reds it's interesting because it'll kind of break apart the red into like orange and pink. At least that's what the Ohuhu markers did. I think, yeah, I mean, that's more or less, I guess, what I would expect with Copic markers. I usually use this type of technique for like galaxy effects, although clearly you could use it for like blood splatter. But I'm very pleased with the way that the colorless blender behaved. Rubbing alcohol is like always a little bit hit or miss. I can show you more in a way that I would like normally utilize it. I'll show you that using this purple. Because normally something that I would do, normally I would just take a brush, dip it into the rubbing alcohol and kind of drop it onto the color, and it creates sort of these cool bubble effects. And this behaves, again, very similar to the way the Copic markers behave, and I'm pretty impressed with that as well. So you could definitely use this with Blick markers. I would not recommend using it with the Ohuhu markers though, because it was a lot less of a noticeable difference. But that is kind of a look at the Blick Studio brush markers. I like these, and I'm just gonna kind of give you my closing thoughts. All right, so final thoughts. What do I think of these? So far, based on the swatches and sort of the test that I did, I think I'm gonna really like these. I actually think these are the closest Copic marker alternative that I have tested out so far on my channel. And I know that's a bold statement, and I definitely still have some criticisms, but so far, I think I'm gonna like these. Obviously, I won't know until I try them out and I actually use them for an illustration, but overall, very impressed. Now, a couple of things that I do wanna note, these are on the higher end of the cheaper marker alternatives. They retail, like I mentioned at the beginning, for $40, give or take a few cents, but that's 24 markers for $40. That is significantly more expensive than the Ohuhu markers that I tried out, and even a little bit more pricey than the concept markers. Now, I know you guys might be thinking, well, if I'm gonna spend more, why not go for something like Winsor & Newton or Prismacolor? But I actually think these are really good. Obviously, the only downside for me that is most notable is that they're not refillable. At least as far as I know, Dick Blick has no intentions of creating refills for these markers, and that is a huge drawback. And I think that is the biggest thing that puts Copic above the rest, is that in the long run they are cheaper because you can buy refills and they're more sustainable for the environment that way as well. But if you're not sure if you like working with markers, something like this is a great place to start. And even if you're not sure if you like these, maybe you're not sure if you like, you know, any alcohol-based medium in general, you can start with the Ohuhu markers, and then as you sort of grow out of those and want to try something new, you can upgrade to something like these. So these are kind of more of an intermediate marker, I suppose, whereas the concept marker and the Ohuhu markers might be better for beginners. These might be better for those of you that know you like markers but just aren't ready to make the jump to Copics. Giving you the taste of the brush nib is going to be a very beneficial experience, and I think you guys will quickly fall in love with it. So I really think that this is a good set, although I do wish there was a couple more kind of basic neutrals in here, maybe a couple more grays, maybe a couple lighter earth tones. But overall, I really have no complaints because you can purchase those individually. You can purchase them on Dick Blick. And for those of you that have a Dick Blick store near you, you can go in person and kind of feel them and hold them and see if there's something that you would like. I am not fortunate enough to have a Dick Blick store near me, but if you did, that's a huge advantage. Like I said, I order mine online. I will link them down below as well. I promise I'm not sponsored. I just get most of my art supplies on there, so I'll link you guys to it in case you guys are interested. The other big con that I kind of have is just that the case is not really that easy to like pull the markers out of. That one came out okay, but as I was kind of working with these, it's just kind of hard to pull them out. They don't have a very strong smell, which is great. That was my big complaint about the concept markers. They gave me such a headache. I could barely stand to work with them. The Ohuhu markers didn't have a very strong scent, and these don't either. So that's a really big plus in my opinion. There is some consistency in the color coding system, and that is something I really do appreciate. On the packaging, they tend to go more by the names, which the names are kind of useless to me because I'm more about the numbers, because the numbers give me an idea of how the colors relate to each other. So there does seem to be some intuition with the color coding, but it's not always clear and consistent, although you could maybe find more information about that online. If I find any resources or color charts or anything like that for these markers, I will link them down below. I always recommend swatching out your markers just so you know what you're working with. That's what I recommend doing, and that's what I did here, just so you know what the color actually looks like, because the color on the cap is always deceiving. That's just gonna be true for any marker product, because how it looks on paper is not gonna look how it looks on plastic. But it's clear to me that like there was some thought put into this color scheme. I just don't fully understand it. Like with the colors 048 and 044, 044 is lighter than 048, but then you have instances like 038 and 039 where 038 is darker. Yeah, I don't know. It's just kind of one of those things where like you just kind of have to figure it out. And that is why I have them laid out like they are here and how they are on my color chart, because I want that consistency of not having to do a lot of guesswork to get the color that I want. I like that you get a good mix of lights, mediums, and darks. I think that that's a really valuable thing. My only complaint is that there's a few colors in here that I don't really think work well with other colors in the set. Like I mentioned, the violet is just such a true violet that it just kind of stands alone and doesn't work well with other colors. But that being said, the markers do appear to layer really, really well, and you could probably manipulate this color to fit whatever you needed it for, which is a nice bonus. So overall, I really have no criticisms against these markers that I don't have against Copic markers. So I think that puts them pretty high up on the list of really good markers that I could recommend to you guys. And I think that the price is right. I feel like $40 is a great value for this set. I will continue to review markers that are a little bit more expensive than this and a little bit less expensive than this, just to give you guys the variety. Plus, you guys just really seem to like marker reviews, and they're always a nice thing for me to potentially give away at some point in the future, you know. Just saying. But that's it for my review today, you guys. Stay tuned for the demo, which will be this Friday's video, and subscribe and thumbs up the video if you want to see more from me. I feel like I had something else to say, but I forgot, so I'm just gonna end the video here. Okay. I love these earrings. Do you love this? I love this. Okay. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys Friday. Be there or be square. Bye.